The Troubles was a violent conflict that took place mainly in Northern Ireland between the late 1960s and 1998. Although it is often described as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, the underlying issue was actually political and national identity. On one side were the Unionists and Loyalists, who were mostly Protestant and wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. On the other side were the Nationalists and Republicans, who were mostly Catholic and sought the reunification of Ireland. The conflict was rooted in decades of political, social, and economic inequalities. Many members of the Catholic community experienced discrimination in areas such as housing, employment, and political representation. As tensions increased, civil rights demonstrations were met with resistance, leading to violence and instability. Over time, the conflict escalated and involved paramilitary organizations, security forces, and civilians. During approximately 30 years of violence, more than 3,500 people lost their lives and thousands more were injured. Unlike many armed conflicts, the troubles were not resolved through military victory. Instead, the conflict ended through negotiation, compromise, and political dialogue. The most important milestone was the Good Friday Agreement, signed on April 10, 1998. This agreement was a result of extensive negotiation involving political leaders, governments, and representatives from different sectors of society. The agreement established a new political framework based on power sharing between Unionists and Nationalists. Rather than allowing one group to dominate the other, it created institutions that required cooperation and joint decision making. It also strengthened cooperation between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, while recognizing the legitimacy of different identities and political aspirations within Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement is widely regarded as one of the most successful peace agreements of the 20th century because it significantly reduced violence and created the conditions necessary for long term stability. Several actors played crucial roles in achieving peace. Amongst the most important political leaders were Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Bertie Ahern, Taoiseach of Ireland. Their cooperation and commitment to negotiations were fundamental to the success of the peace process. Another key figure was George Mitchell, a United States Senator who acted as an independent mediator during the negotiations. His leadership helped build trust amongst parties that had been in conflict for decades. The peace process also involved unionist political parties, nationalist political parties, and representatives of paramilitary organizations. Although these groups had opposing interests, their participation was essential because lasting peace could only be achieved if all major stakeholders were included in the negotiations. Transitional justice played a crucial role in helping Northern Ireland move from conflict to peace. However, the Northern Irish model differs significantly from other transitional justice experiences, such as South Africa. Instead of focusing primarily on criminal prosecutions or a national truth commission, Northern Ireland prioritized political reconciliation, institutional reform, and democratic participation. The objective was to transform a deeply divided society into one capable of peaceful coexistence. Transitional justice helped reduce sectarian tensions, strengthen democratic institutions, and promote trust between communities that had previously viewed each other as enemies. This approach recognized that achieving sustainable peace required more than simply ending violence. It required creating institutions and policies capable of preventing future conflict and protecting the rights of all citizens. Several transitional justice mechanisms were implemented to support this transformation. The first was the creation of power sharing institutions. These institutions ensured that both unionist and nationalist communities would participate in government and decision making processes. A second mechanism was police reform. The police force was restructured to increase accountability, representation, and public trust, particularly amongst communities that had historically felt excluded or discriminated against. Another important measure was the release of certain prisoners associated with paramilitary organizations. Although controversial, this measure was considered necessary to support reconciliation and encourage commitment to the peace process. Northern Ireland also adopted stronger human rights protections and anti discrimination measures. These reforms sought to address historical inequalities and promote equal treatment under the law. Finally, several victim support and truth recovery initiatives were established. While Northern Ireland did not create a single Truth and Reconciliation Commission, efforts were made to investigate unresolved cases, recognize victims, and preserve historical memory. These mechanisms reflect the main pillars of transitional justice: truth, justice, reparations, institutional reform, and guarantees of non recurrence.
The second study case in which we'll be covering it will be the case of South Africa and apartheid. South Africa's conflict originated from the apartheid system, which is a regime of racial segregation which was implemented from 1948 by the white minority government. Under this apartheid, South Africans were classified by their race and granted different rights based on the classification they were put on. White citizens enjoyed political power and economic privileges, while black South Africans and other racial groups were limited of equal human rights. This including education, freedom of movement, and political participation. Now, millions of people were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to segregated areas known as homelands or Bantustans. Opposition to the system was met with arrest, censorship, police brutality, and political repression. As a result, resistance movements such as labor unions, churches, and civil society organizations increasingly mobilized against apartheid. By the 1980s, South Africa faced widespread protests, economic difficulties, and international pressure, especially from the Commonwealth. This through sanctions and diplomatic isolation. And it was these internal and external pressures that weakened the regime and created the conditions for negotiation that would eventually bring apartheid to an end. Now, unlike most cases of transitional justice, the end of apartheid is considered to be a successful one. This based that it was a negotiated political transition. South Africa's transformation was achieved primarily through dialogue and compromise between the government and the apartheid movements that were happening at the time. A major turning point was in 1990 when President F.W. de Klerk announced the implementation of several reforms, legalizing political organizations, releasing political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, and there were these actions that eventually opened a door for negotiations about this political transition. And although there was a lot of backlash and a lot of challenges within the process, including political violence and mistrust between the two groups, these talks eventually produced an interim constitutional framework and established the way for South Africa's first elections in 1994, which Nelson Mandela was elected president, marking the end officially of apartheid and the beginning of this new democratic era. Now, towards the end of apartheid, there were main actors involved. On the side of the government, it was the President F.W. de Klerk, as well as the political party that eventually gave in to this pressure from the opposition. And on the opposition side, the African National Congress, as well as Nelson Mandela, were central figures in advocating for democracy and this racial equality within the country. Mandela's leadership is still considered one of the most important due to the promotion of reconciliation and negotiation instead of revenge, like it has happened in a lot of other cases of transitional justice. Other important actors would be civil society organizations, churches, labor unions, and community groups, as well as the international actors such as the United Nations, foreign governments, anti-apartheid activists worldwide, including Desmond Tutu. Together, these actors eventually created the conditions necessary for this peaceful transition. Towards the end of apartheid, a lot of transitional justice mechanisms were implemented. The most important one was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established by Desmond Tutu in 1995. This commission investigated human rights violations committed during apartheid and organized public hearings where victims could share their experience. And this one distinctive feature of this system was the conditional amnesty, which is still criticized to this day, where individuals responsible for politically motivated crimes could receive amnesty if they fully disclose the truth about their actions. Apart from that, South Africa also implemented a lot of measures such as recognizing the victims and providing reparations. So, although it's been criticized that these have been insufficient, the country also adopted a new democratic constitution, as well as strengthening the rule of law and reforming key institutions such as the judiciary and the electoral. Now, these measures aim not only to address past abuses but also prevent future violations of human rights.
Before concluding, it is important to compare how transitional justice was implemented in Northern Ireland and South Africa. Both cases share several similarities. First, neither conflict was resolved through military victory. Instead, both transitions were achieved through negotiation and political compromise. Second, both societies sought reconciliation and long term peace rather than revenge. Third, both processes included institutional reforms aimed at preventing future violence and strengthening democratic governance. Finally, both recognize the importance of addressing historical injustices and promoting coexistence amongst previously divided communities. However, there are also significant differences. The most important difference is the way each society addressed truth and accountability. In South Africa, transitional justice was centered on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which provided a public platform for victims and perpetrators to share their experiences. The process emphasized truth telling, acknowledgement and wrongdoing, and restorative justice. In contrast, Northern Ireland did not establish a single national truth commission. Instead, it focused on political agreements, power sharing institutions, security reforms, and democratic participation. The priority was maintaining peace and stability, even if some questions about truth and accountability remained unresolved. Another difference is that South Africa directly confronted the legacy of apartheid through a national process of public recognition and historical reconstruction, whereas Northern Ireland adopted a more gradual and fragmented approach to dealing with the past. These differences demonstrate that there is no single mode of transitional justice. Each society designs its own mechanisms and according to its historical circumstances, political realities, and peace building needs.
The cases of South Africa and Northern Ireland show that transitional justice is not a simple process, but it is a set of mechanisms adapted to the needs of each society. In South Africa, the transition focused on truth telling, reconciliation, and institutional reforms. This through the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, while in Ireland, the emphasis was placed on political negotiations, power sharing, and peace building. This through agreements. Now, both countries face challenges related to accountability, victims' rights, and lasting effects of their conflicts. However, they successfully moved away from the violence and authoritarian practices that they were holding. These cases showed that lasting peace often requires a balance between justice, truth, reconciliation, and political compromise. However, it is important to notice that victims are still vulnerable in cases of transitional justice, and this continues to have an effect in the modern world.